welcome back to Diverse Joy, a podcast where two experts bring joy back into conversations about diversity. This is my co-host, the fabulous, fun, and colorful Dr. Will Cox.
Oh, thank you. And this is my amazing co-host, also colorful, especially today, because we are celebrating Trans Awareness Month for this episode. My co-host, Dr. Amber Nelson. And since this is Trans Awareness Month, we invited our dear friend, Sandy Eichel, back to the podcast for the second time. Now, Sandy is a transgender, non-binary person, and we wanted them...
Just a second, Dr. Cox.
I can't believe you're interrupting
I know,
me.
I know.
We rehearsed.
How
dare you?
How rude.
So rude.
How rude. Now, I have a question.
Oh, yes,
You're
please.
talking about Trans Awareness Month, and you're saying we brought Sandy back specifically for this. Isn't that tokenism?
How dare you?
I know.
How dare
I'm the
you?
worst. I'm the worst.
Ask me the question we rehearsed. Thank you for asking. So a lot of people kind of have that gut reaction or that knee-jerk reaction, this idea of tokenism, which is something that can be a problem. Often in like a classroom setting, let's say, if an instructor turns to the one black student in the room, it's like, how does the black community feel about this? Asking that person to represent their whole community.
Yes.
That's tokenism.
Right.
What we're talking about is representation, which is just, we brought on Sandy as themselves. We want them to share their story.
Right.
The trans community did not elect Sandy, no matter what they tell you.
Wait a minute. I don't speak for all trans queer people everywhere. I thought that I did.
I thought so too.
I know.
I mean, the show was, only possible because all black people elected Amber.
have been elected
correct.
to speak for the black experience.
All scientists
Yes.
and gay men elected me.
Yes, yes.
And of course,
cool.
all the...
Exactly.
But no, so that's the difference between tokenism and just representation. Sandy is going to share their experiences, some which will be in common with other trans and non-binary folks, and some which will not. But we're getting to know them and their joy, sharing their joy, and that's what we want to start with. So Sandy, it's November, Trans Awareness Month. What is bringing you joy lately?
My joy is always planning and getting ready for my wife and I throw an annual solstice party. We celebrate the solstice and the change of the seasons and, darkness going into light. And we bring all of our most important people together in one place to celebrate that. And I look forward to it every year.
And so many of your friends, myself included, we plan everything around it.
That's correct.
Like,
it is.
People
it
figure
is
out
a
when's
thing.
the solstice party, and then they figure out when they're traveling for Christmas or whatever.
Yes.
Amazing.
And it is just as joyful as you're making it sound. I'm looking forward to it. Any sneak peeks you want to give us for this year's party?
There's always a competition.
Yeah, usually some kind of contest or...
There's a contest or we've done like pajama pants and slippers. And this year, as you recall, it is full costumes, seasonal costumes, whatever that means to you.
So you could dress up as Mrs. Dash. That's a season.
Exactly. Whatever that means to you. And I cannot wait to see what our friends bring because they bring it.
They bring it.
And then other contests that they have, they always hide a pickle in
several pickles.
Several pickles.
Yeah.
That's was it Polish?
Well, it's attributed to German, but it's
German.
not actually. But we just do it because it's fun.
It's
and
fun.
And we
Yeah,
love to
yeah.
see our friends look like children just trying to find it.
And
pickles,
Sandy's wife Nancy spends the whole year shopping for pickle ornaments
Oh,
because
that's so cool.
once there was a picture frame, and in the picture that was in the picture frame there was a pickle on the shelf behind someone.
Oh
something
wow!
like that.
Wow,
really
that is really impressive.
Yeah.
That is really impressive.
Last year, Roman won our producer Eric Roman Binding won the top prize, right?
That's correct.
With
Ooh.
abstract cutout of the inside of a pickle that had the word pickle kind of
That's
laser
correct.
etched into
Wow!
That is
wow!
It was,
Wow!
It's impressive.
it. And everyone else was like, "What? It's
That's
always
impressive.
surprising and exciting."
It really is. Amber, what's bringing you joy right now?
Yeah.
It is November, and you're talking about solstice and all this. It is sweater weather.
Yes,
It is sweater weather.
sweater weather.
And I I love sweater weather. Like, one, just because it's fall and cozy, but also I have this massive holiday sweater collect. Like, it is obnoxiously large.
Fantastic.
I wear a different holiday sweater every single day from Thanksgiving to New Year's.
Yes.
And it celebrates all holidays in between, winter holidays.
Right.
And, I even start earlier than that. I have my Halloween sweaters too.
Yeah, right on.
So really it's like creeping to like Halloween and on. So yeah, it's my time where I get to pull them all out. I have my special racks that I put out and hang them all up and get them prepared and ready and start to wear them. And so it's my favorite time of year.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
We always do a little fun fashion. We always try to dress in some fun themed way for the video audience. Next month for December, we got to do sweaters.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't not wear a sweater. So.
Well, yeah, it's physically impossible.
It's physically impossible.
No matter what
It's
theme
true.
I say,
It's
you're going to
true.
show up in a sweater.
That's
I will be showing up in a sweater no matter what. Yes, 100%.
What's your joy, Will?
My joy, so we're just coming out of Halloween, and as you two know, but I'll share with the audience for the first time. I have a costume room. Well, I should say we, my fiance, our producer, and I have a hidden room in our basement. It's behind
amazing.
like a fake, well, it's a real bookcase, but it's on wheels that reveals a door, which is a TARDIS door. It's the TARDIS from Doctor Who.
I love it.
And then inside is all of our cosplay stuff, a huge array of costumes that we've collected, and because we throw these theme parties and we do Comic Cons and stuff, as Amber also does lots of cosplay, and actually Sandy and their wife have donated lots of costumes over the years, because when people do a one-off costume for like a theme party and then they don't know what to do with it, well, we adopt it. Exactly. It's our little orphanage.
It can be reused and loved by other people, and we all share in the fun.
Yeah, and so it's a little, mini community resource for our friend groups.
It is definitely like something that I aspire to. Like when I have my own space that I can really create. Right now, all my stuff is in like tubs and in storage and like the extra closet in my spare room, but I dream of a day where I can have just a closet, like a whole room dedicated to costumes. It's amazing.
Well, and for a while it got really messy because sometimes you're trying to figure out a costume, you try on one thing, try another thing, and then it ends up in a pile, which vexes my fiance to no end.
He likes organization.
That's fair.
But he's marrying Will.
But we recently True.
Sad day
He knew what he was
for
getting
you.
into.
That's fair.
Okay,
That's fair.
But,
That's fair. Yeah.
But we just cleaned it all up and reorganized it and have recommitted to keeping it that way, which will last for a while.
For a little while. You'll have to come back.
Well, as our skills going to teach us later, practice until practice is important. So we will practice keeping it clean. But right now it is nice, perfectly organized. You can walk through. There's a Star Wars section, Star Trek section, all the horror monster section. It's all
Perfect.
So great.
So that's bringing me
great.
joy.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
All right, so the main topic that we wanted to focus on today for Trans Awareness Month is really just, again, with this representation being a key theme, have Sandy kind of share their story, how they got from where they started, which I'll let them characterize, to the fabulous, fully realized, authentic, trans non-binary person that they are today, living their best life. And so Amber hasn't heard this
really
background
excited
before.
to hear your background and your story. So
and
I'm ready for story time.
And I knew Sandy through part of this story at least.
Yes.
And so I might share a bit related to that. But you are the star, as always.
Oh,
of course.
thank you. Well,
Please
thank you.
tell us.
Well,
And I would want it no other way, right?
Sandy, this is your life.
Oh my
Tell
God.
us.
It's all happening. Okay.
Spotlight.
Well, the first thing I want to say too about all of our stories is that we're constantly in evolution, right? All of us every day are hopefully digging deep in ourselves, finding new truths and finding more of ourselves. And I think that I really want to encourage everybody who's listening to this or watching this to think about their life in that way, because I think we often think of ourselves as a destination, and my story is definitely a situation where it's a journey. So I was a Lutheran pastor's wife, and like like to the max. Like I mean, in pictures, I've been compared to, Donna Reed and
Betty Crocker.
Betty Crocker, like you name it. I mean, dresses, high heel shoes, like very ultra feminine. And I was married to a Lutheran pastor and played that role extremely well. And, but was secretly miserable, was just really under the surface, and the facade that I played, was a really miserable person because I was morphing and pleasing other people. Right. And, my whole life was made of should. Yeah. I should do this. I should be this. I should present heterosexually. I should, be married to a man, all this stuff. And as we've said many times, I was shoulding all over myself. So don't do it. Don't anyone ever should over themselves. I bet you have. And I got to a point where my life was pretty intolerable. And it was a time when I was living in a very rural situation in the parsonage, the house owned by the church across the parking lot from Little White Clabber Church in the middle of nowhere. And I really realized that something had to change. And as I started to realize who I am as a queer person, at the time, the only words that I had that made any sense to me was being a lesbian, because it was a word that I knew. And I was like, okay, well, I think maybe I'm a lesbian. And then I also looked at my spouse and realized that my spouse wasn't living their truth either, and asked them if they identified as transgender, and they did. And so she transitioned, because I was absolutely in support of that. We weren't a part of the church during that period, but in that process, Will's got a question.
I believe you were the first ever married lesbian couple to be recognized by the state of Wisconsin. Am I correct?
Well, I don't know that we were the first lesbian couple to be recognized, but we were the first divorced same-sex couple in the state of Wisconsin, because we had been married for over 10 years as a straight presenting couple. And so
but they recognized your wife's transition.
Yeah, they had to recognize our marriage after she transitioned, after we'd been married as a straight couple for 10 years. So we found the loophole, and then we broke it.
And this was before same-sex marriage was legalized.
Wow. Yeah. So and supporting her and going through that process of seeing all of the discrimination that she faced really turned me into a trans activist. And a lot of my identity was swept to the side in that situation for various reasons, but it gave me just a passion and fighting for people after seeing it up close and personally, and not at that point having the ability to peel back that next layer of my own gender identity. Okay, so I was divorced from my ex, and then was out as a lesbian, identifying as female and gay. And that went on for a while. I met my wife, Nancy, and we got married. And several... That's right, my current wife, and she's awesome. And a few years after we had been married, I went to a conference where, for the first time, I was in a room with gender nonconforming and non-binary folks for a roundtable discussion. And I was listening to these people share their stories, and I felt it so deeply in my soul. I mean, tears of joy came to my eyes. I finally felt like this feels so authentically me. This is the kind of, there's still a little bit of struggle with my gender identity, even though I had been a trans activist, even though I had supported my ex-wife who was trans and all of that. And I was really fighting to change like the insurance industry for trans folks and all this stuff. I realized, like, wait a minute, I lost myself kind of in that shuffle, and I am a non-binary person, and sexual orientation wise, I also identify as pansexual. That it was the box that I felt like I kind of had to go into, because it was the one that I knew. And I mean, I don't know if the kids had created pansexual, that word, yet, which I love. Way to go. And and so that was like the next layer. And so I think that's when we talk about our stories and our journeys and the evolution that we keep exploring. And that is, I think, something that's important for us to do as allies to other communities too. I mean, I hear the feedback a lot of like, oh, well, there's all this terminology that wasn't around 5 or 10 years ago. Yeah, that's right. Because English is a living language. Exactly. And we all have to grow and change and adapt and practice new things.
Absolutely. You're right. And there are a lot of terms,
Yeah.
right? And there are a lot of new things. And at the end of the day, I'm sure we'll talk more about this. It's just like, if somebody's used a term, they describe it to you, just use the term, right?
That's
Like,
right.
and again, and being curious about your own identity. I think that is a really beautiful part of your story. And I'm sure there's a lot of pain in that. Like, I identify as Christian, and it's a big part for me. Like, I recognize the harm that the church has done, especially to the queer community. And it's a space that I sit in a lot of. Like, I want to bring wholeness and healing back to that relationship, at least in the relationship with me. And just being able to like see how that progressed for you.
Yeah.
And I imagine that like going to like, I identify as a lesbian, right? Like it had to kind of be this like stark, like, I understand this term.
Exactly.
I
Yes,
understand
exactly.
this term. I know what this is because it is the opposite of what I thought that I was, right? And now like, and then as you start to explore, and then again, supporting your ex-wife and their transition and understanding themselves. And it's like, even that, like, I can understand trans, I understand lesbian, you know, and now it's like, oh, but there's so much more.
There's so much more. And
there's
we
so
didn't
much
have
more
models.
to sexuality. There's so much more to gender identity. And now that I've kind of gone through my own transition phase, right? Like my transition out of kind of heterosexual normativity to this, now I have the freedom and space to further develop and understand. And in a lot of ways, when I talk about even spiritual practices or things like that, we talk about deconstructing, right? And I think that there's a part of that for you around your identity and around like deconstructing my understanding of what gender is and was, and gender expression and sexuality. And it doesn't have to be this, like, if I'm turning away from, quote unquote, if we were to use that term, from a heterosexual normativity, doesn't mean I have to go to the other end of the quote unquote spectrum, which I don't particularly like the idea of a spectrum, because I think that, well, we even see the research shows that like most people aren't all one or the other anyway. And there's like this more amorphous blend
Shades of gray,
shades of rainbow, like however you want to call it. Like there's so many different expressions and around masculinity and femininity, and that everybody has so much of that. So I don't really like the idea of a spectrum, but kind of moving from like this idea of very, you know, a rigid concept of what that is to maybe even another rigid concept of what it is. It's just the opposite end of what I thought I was.
And also the fact that there were no models to me on television or anywhere else. I did not see anyone that was expressing or was identifying the way that I felt inside. And I think that's why visibility is so important. And
representation
that's like,
matters.
Representation matters,
and,
absolutely.
You know, and during Trans Awareness Week, that's one of the things that we have to like be thinking about is that for those of us who are in an environment where we're safe enough to be out and to tell our stories, it then empowers other people to be their true selves. And you know, and it doesn't take away from anyone else. And that I think is a really important part of that, because in that time period, that was as close as I could find. So yeah,
that's a really good point.
Welcome back to Diverse Joy. Now we're going to do our story time. So we always kind of have one that more difficult or negative kind of story, and then because we're bringing the joy, a more positive one. And this week, as we talked about the potential stories, we decided that I'd share kind of a negative story that happened to a client of mine. So as you, the listeners and viewers, know, I do a lot of work putting out this evidence-based bias habit-breaking training with organizations all over the world. And people often share, you know, types of bias and things that they've experienced. One of the things that we cover in this training is talking about how being an ally is really important, because very often, if you're a member of a group that's disadvantaged by bias, when you speak up about things, people don't take it as seriously. So when a white person speaks up about bias against people of color, they get taken more seriously than when people of color do. And I always say, we all need to be speaking up, but if you're an ally, extra power to speak up and be heard. And as one response to this, one of the people in this audience shared this. He was a trans man, and before he transitioned, pushed a lot in his company to get some trans and LGBT policies that helped protect those employees. But at the time, the people passing those policies didn't know that he was a trans man. Well, then after these policies were passed, he ended up transitioning, coming out as his true self, living as a man. And they were like, wait, you're transgender? And then they questioned all those policies that they had passed and actually rescinded some of them because they, quote unquote, thought he was kind of tricking them into doing something that would help him down the road. Just, and when he shared that story, I was like, oh my gosh.
That's heartbreaking.
That's heartbreaking.
And so that's again, our negative story, and very unfortunate. But also, I believe Sandy, you came with a positive story to bring us back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also can say though that I relate to that person's that story too, because a lot of times we can advocate for other people before we advocate for ourselves.
100%.
And a lot of times that's not an uncommon situation where a person that is not yet come to terms with their gender identity is advocating for others. Because, and I had that too of like, well, everyone else gets to be their true self, just not me. The rules are different
and
for
I
me.
Want them to be able to be their true self.
So I think I relate to that a lot, and I feel a lot of compassion for that person. The positive story that I will say about my gender identity is that, and this is the first time that this ever, that it happened in my life. I was shocked and so pleased that I had gone into the emergency room or I should say urgent care at a health clinic, a health system that I had just gotten new insurance for. And they asked me in that visit what my chosen name was and what my pronouns were, which in itself was spectacular, huge
in a health system. Absolutely
correct. And it was put into the system.
That's amazing.
And every single time I interact with that health system, regardless of what doctor I'm seeing and where that location is, they use my pronouns and my chosen name. And that I cannot put into words how important that is and how much that healthcare already has a lot of barriers.
There's so much there.
And we could talk about a whole other podcast on that. But that safety that creates for me is huge.
Feeling seen, feeling like when I go here, I know they're going to tend to my individual, my needs, and I'm not going to have to go through and explain. I'm not going to have to be harmed in the process of going to my doctor, which is so often the case for non-binary and trans folks going to healthcare systems. And I personally do a lot of work with healthcare systems, and they often are like, oh, it's really difficult because we have to have this name and da-da-da-da. But it's really great to hear there are systems that are figuring it out. They're using it. They're integrating it across the board and making these experiences that can be so traumatizing and harmful for this community to be healing and restorative going into a healthcare system, which is, again, a space that is so necessary for everybody, but especially for trans folks and folks that are needing, all of the things. So we really need it to be a positive experience. I'm really glad. It's super cool. I'm going to use it as an example. Anytime I talk to healthcare systems, I'm like, there are systems that can do this, so you can do it too. Right.
Oh, so amazing. All right, so as always, we try to bring in an audience question, and this is actually one that just gets asked all the time when I get talks, and I'm going to ask it in the kind of blunt way. What's the deal with pronouns? Why do people have these little parentheses after their names with their pronouns?
Why should I have to learn something new and use someone's chosen pronouns?
Well, what's up with pronouns?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that let's never use the term preferred pronouns because they're not preferred. They are my pronouns. And what's up with the pronouns is that it is human respect and safety for someone to use my pronouns. And it's such a huge, I can't put into words how important language is. But that someone is acknowledging you as you present and using the correct verbiage that makes them feel safe, that makes them feel like they belong. And that is hugely important. And I would say too that introducing yourself, if you are a person who identifies as cisgender, meaning you identify with the what you were assigned at birth as far as your gender identity, then you have a unique opportunity to introduce yourself in professional and new settings of meeting people by using your pronouns. That if you identify as he or she and you say, my name is this and my pronouns are he or she, it sends a message to everyone that you talk to that they can be who they are, that you acknowledge the fact that pronouns do not necessarily conform and that this person doesn't have to conform to gender norms. And it tells all the people who are cisgender that this is important to you, and you are modeling in a way to everyone. And it even if the person has not yet come to terms with that, that is a huge step in being an ally. And so pronouns are very important.
And one thing I want to add is that I don't think there's anyone out there advocating where it's like everyone needs to have to say their pronouns after, because they're, as you were just saying, there are people who are still figuring it out and having to say it. Like being forced to by some norm or whatever isn't what people are advocating for. They're not, because people have to figure it out sometimes. And we're not putting them in the position of being forced to pick one.
And that's a really important point, because I remember even, and maybe miss on my end, I was teaching a class on human sexuality and I was having everybody introduce themselves, and I just, maybe not flippantly, but I was like, here's my name, my pronouns. Oh, introduce yourselves, your pronouns. And I had a conversation later that was like, I don't feel like you have earned the right to my pronouns yet. And I was like, you know what? You're absolutely right. Like, what I need to say is, here's my name, here are my pronouns. If you would like to share them, you can share your pronouns. Like, instead of setting this stage for you to like be forced to share your pronouns or out yourself if you're not ready or whatever that is, or maybe you're still like questioning and trying to figure things out for yourself, and being put on the spot like that is triggering. And so it was something for me that I really sat in, even in my attempts to be inclusive, that even my language around asking so pointedly also was kind of a miss too. And so how can we do that, and especially in like public spaces? If there's a relationship, that's different. But when it's a public space, like how we can do it through modeling, which invites others to then share theirs should they want
if
to.
they want to.
And I think a lot of the negative backlash when it occurs is because there is a perception of, we're making this a rule. Every time you speak, you're going to share your pronouns. Right. Again, I don't think anyone's actually pushing for that. But it is something that shows respect to use other people's correct pronouns. And also, if you are comfortable sharing and it's not a big deal for you, then why would it be a big deal? Share.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that we know that misgendering people, meaning using the incorrect pronouns, is something that is absolutely a psychological, hurt and oppression on them, and it takes its toll.
Absolutely.
And we'll, that's why it's so important when people are talking about, like, I mean, I hear this all the time, especially with pronouns that are they, them, theirs, right? I hear this all the time.
Folks
of like, it's not grammatically correct. And I'm like, okay, first of all, the singular they has been around
always been a thing.
Time. Hello Shakespeare. Okay, so whatever. And we do it all the time when we don't know the gender of someone, when we're talking about something in the news or something. They'll say the whistleblower has yet to reveal themselves, but they have, and no problem at all in legal documents and everything else. But then when, those of us who use they, them, their pronouns are like, it's so difficult. Like anything in inclusion, like anything in bettering ourselves, it takes practice. And when someone tells you their pronoun, then use it. And if you, and this is the other part of centering yourself into someone else's experience and making them safe, that if you misgender them, correct yourself simply and move on.
And move on.
That and because the opposite of that, and this many well-intentioned people
Right.
have done this to me, and to lots of other folks, lots of other trans folks, of like they'll say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I know this is so important, and I'm just here to tell you that nobody wants to be on the other end of that. That is so centering yourself in your own, as opposed to just saying, oh, she was, no, I'm sorry, they were going blah, 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 blah. And that's perfect. You apologize, you correct, you move on. And then the work, the apology that you wanted to do in front of that person happens when you're not with that person. Back to your home with your spouse, your partner, your cat, your houseplant.
Right.
You then practice that person's pronouns at least 3 or 4 times so that you can get that and you can do better.
Absolutely.
And that to me is it's again, when we talk about like performative things, that big, huge apology and making a big deal about it, it
doesn't do anything
and
but
it-
actually
but
harm
actually
the person
harm-
that you are supposedly trying to be centering and helping or, supporting.
Yeah.
And this really ties into our skill for today. But before we go to that, I wanted to come back to what you were talking about, the psychological safety and the trauma. You know, we were talking about earlier before we started filming. I was talking about a young trans person that I was working with in a pediatric clinic that was about 8 years old, that identified as trans, and how difficult it was for the team to kind of adopt their name and their pronouns. And but you have this really important statistic about how important that is.
Misgendering and dead naming people. And dead naming, if you've not heard that term before, is using the name of the person before they transitioned, so the name that they were assigned, as opposed to the name that they have chosen. Yeah. And when we know, the science shows us that when children, especially teens, adolescents, when they are being surrounded by people who use the correct pronouns and use their chosen name, their likelihood of depression and suicidal ideation can go down up to 71%. And that is huge, because 1 out of every 5 transgender people in the United States has attempted suicide. And I am one of those people. So I will tell you that makes a huge difference. And there's a lot of, again, in a well-meaning thing, and I understand that people's intentions are very positive, but it's really about our impact that we make.
Absolutely.
And so, I've been in a lot of conversations where people will be telling me about someone else. As a non-binary trans person, people want to tell me about, I know a trans
all the
person,
people that they know.
and you're like, that's wonderful, that's great.
That's great for you.
Oh, you're gay. Do you know Gay Will? I'm like, oh yes, of course.
We're all in a group chat.
He wasn't
actually
at last week's meeting, but Oh yeah, Gay Joe. Everyone knows Gay
Everybody
Joe.
knows Gay Joe. Yeah.
So this was a person that was talking about their child and their child's friend who is transgender, and they said, my kid's best friend is Taylor, but their name used to be Samantha. And I'm like, okay. And I said, okay, can you just say that their name is Taylor, and that please do not dead name them, even if they've told
you're
you
referring to it as a dead name,
and even if you've been told by them that you can use it, that doesn't mean in public, because it sends a message to everyone around you that it is okay to call out someone's dead name. And so dead naming and misgendering are, another statistic is that the Human Rights Tribunal in British Columbia in 2021 found that dead naming and misgendering is a human rights violation. That is because of the psychological damage that it does. So so I think that's one of those things that's really important for people to remember and think about when they're trying to be inclusive of people around them.
Absolutely. And the other part of this too is that you're talking about not only not using the dead name, but keeping their pronouns consistent to what they are, not what they quote unquote used to be, right? Yes. Like even when you're referring to them before transition, that you always use the pronouns that their pronouns,
Yes.
right? Not necessarily pronouns that what they used to be, right? And always kind of always centering and honoring this person's identity as they have told you what their identity is. And that's huge. And again, it comes back to that psychological safety,
Right.
and how important that is when we're working with trans youth, trans folks, and non-binary folks. That like that statistic is staggering, right?
Yeah.
Like if you can center and honor those things, that it can decrease by 71%. Like
It's
that's
huge.
life saving.
Why wouldn't you?
There you lose nothing
Yes.
by doing that.
Yes.
Like you said that earlier, you lose nothing by doing it. So why not?
Yeah.
And it does require practice.
Yeah, and if I can share another little anecdote, because it just happened recently, and that is my mother passed away, and I was working with a pastor that was her pastor, who's a very progressive person, and I said, just I would like you to refer to us as her children as opposed to her daughters, because I don't identify as female. And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you told me that. I want to be really inclusive." And I said, my pronouns are they, them, theirs. So we're in the funeral, y'all, and the pastor had misgendered me earlier in the service, which is fine. She just moved on. And then she said something about, she said, Joyce's daughters, children, because made this big, huge thing about it in the funeral. So the funeral reception
switched
was not about
your
condolences
mother,
from everyone and my mother. It was about
you.
my gender identity for the people that didn't know. And that's I just point that out because that's the kind of harm that can be done. And I didn't want
well-intentioned but harmful.
Well-intentioned but absolutely harmful. And it made me wish I'd never told her, which is one of those things. So if you can, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, it's good.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've actually already kind of had some tidbits about our habit-breaking skill. But so one of the main things that we work on in this bias habit-breaking training is helping people retrain their automatic reactions.
Right.
Because as we've talked about with so many things, our initial reactions are very often programmed by society, by culture, by stereotypes. And there's a kind of core set of steps involved whenever you want to retrain an automatic reaction when we're talking about these cognitive and behavioral kinds of things. And I came up with this mnemonic device that I'm very proud of when thinking about the steps when you want to retrain a reaction. And that mnemonic device, those steps are detect, reflect, reject. So first you want to, detect whatever the reaction is, that you've made a mistake, maybe misgendering someone like we've been discussing, or it could be detecting that you made a stereotypic assumption, whatever the thing is. Then you want to reflect on it. And this is within your own mind. You want to bring in your more deliberative, thoughtful cognitive processing, because that helps you. You're not leaving it with just that quick automatic processing that's going to bias you in favor of stereotypes and biases. But bring in that reflective processing. What might be some of the harm with that mistake I just made? Where did I learn this stereotype? Why do I have this assumption? Reflecting on it. And then rejecting it. If thinking of other people in stereotypical or biased ways isn't what you want to do, mentally reject that. Say, that's not who I am. That's not how I want to think. And one of the main ways we apply this is one of the tools in our toolkit, which we call replace stereotypes. The key to this is rehearsal. So you do this detect, reflect, and as part of that reject step, you practice thinking in the way you want to think. And misgendering, and then adjusting when someone comes out to new pronouns, comes out having new pronouns. Is one great way to apply this. As Sandy said earlier, practice it in your mind on your own. Don't subject the person to it, but think about it. And this is something. So as we've kind of described, Sandy and I have known each other for many years. And when I first met Sandy, it was before they had figured out some of these things. And so I knew them using different pronouns for many, many years. And when they came out, it is an adjustment period. That's just the reality of it. And so having this habit of speaking and thinking of Sandy using their previous pronouns, that was my default. That was the habit. That's what I had to start detecting and reflecting and then work at their pronouns. And just as Sandy described, sometimes I don't think I do it as much anymore, but I would slip up, use their incorrect pronoun, and then have to correct myself. And that's what you do. But one thing that we often suggest to people is when you slip up, detect, reflect, reject, and then in your mind, think through 5 or 6 sentences.
Yeah.
They are a snappy dresser. Their hair is on point.
Yeah.
Which
Isn't it?
for our audio listeners,
Yes.
Sandy always has amazing fun-colored hair.
It's this beautiful, like teal purple.
And practice it. As Amber and I like to say, practice makes progress.
Yes.
By rehearsing a different way of responding, that's how we rewire these things in our
Yeah.
minds. And
Can I add something to your?
yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Mix.
Yes,
Yeah.
mix.
Mix. That's
I
how
apologize.
I refer to
Yeah.
in my letters.
I would say as well, because we know this is a teacher trick, that don't just think the new sentences, say them out loud,
yeah.
because your
It's
brain
the rehearsal piece.
learns
Yes.
what you hear yourself say, and we actually know that you learn things more if you say them out loud. So that's why I say say it to your cat, say it to your houseplant,
Yeah.
say it to your favorite pillow.
Yeah.
Practice those pronouns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also want to share. I was in a conversation with one of our mutual friends, Philip Thompson, one of our besties, and we were just, I don't know, we were talking about affirmation in general, and he said, one of the things for me is it doesn't matter if Sandy's in the room or not. If something about Sandy occurs to me, I am using they them pronouns in my head, no matter what. Even
and if I mess up, I'm gonna
I
correct myself, even if they're
in
not
my
in
own
the
mind,
presence.
because that's what respect means.
Yeah.
That's what valuing them means.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's so beautiful.
Oh my God.
He is great. He is great.
Yeah. So good.
Awesome. But yeah, we always like to give Amber a chance to bring in some more of that amazing clinical applied insight.
Yeah.
What else about rehearsal and mental retraining should we know?
Yeah, it's from a therapeutic perspective. There's so much here, right, around detect, reflect, reject, and the rehearsal process. In any time that we're doing and we're trying to break a habit or we're trying to create a new norm for ourselves, we have to do all of these things. From a cognitive behavioral therapy standpoint, we often talk about like an activating event, and then we have kind of our thoughts, and then we feel something, we have a feeling about it, and then it leads into a behavior. And so I kind of think about the same thing around the detect, reflect, and reject is we're detecting this event or this thing and our process, our thoughts, what's happening in our mind. And then the reflection is really sitting with what are the feelings? What are the things that's coming up about this thing? We talked a little bit about this last episode too, but a little bit like what's happening that's associated with these thoughts or this thing that's happening. And then those things, the combination of my thoughts and my feelings leads us into behavior. In order for us to change the behavior, to change how I'm using pronouns or whatever the thing is, I have to then kind of go backwards and reflect on what are the feelings that are coming up. Right. What are my thoughts associated with that? Right. And so that I think is a really great space to, again, apply the detect, reflect, and reject is saying like, I'm going to detect these things. I'm going to detect my thoughts. I'm going to reflect on my feelings to change this behavior. I'm going to reject some of the things I used to do, rehearse, and replace it with something else, right? Yeah. And that's not just behaviorally. I'm not just replacing the behavior, but I'm also replacing my feelings about it and my thoughts associated, which is a lot of what your friend was saying, right? Like even in my own mind, even when Sandy is not present, I am going to practice it. I'm going to change my own thoughts about how I think about Sandy. Yeah. It is no longer this way or this dynamic, but it is this, and I'm going to change that, which then shifts how I feel about the topic, how I feel about this person, and it's going to lead to long-lasting change. And again, I think that fits so perfectly in this idea of detect, reflect, reject. Yeah. So Sandy, one of our last things that we like to do, as you know, is to talk about like recommendations, media, things like that. What kind of recommendations do you have for us? Well, that's like movies,
that
TV
bring you
shows,
joy.
What brings you joy?
Yeah. Well, it's so many things that bring me joy, but I would recommend, if you haven't already seen it, watch Paris is Burning. It's a documentary that was made decades ago, and it 70s, is I mean, and it is so real. It is so raw. It gives the background of the ballroom scene in New York, and it is filled with diverse joy. It is also filled with diverse heartbreak. And
when you say the
understanding.
ballroom scene, all of our listeners
Oh,
might not
well,
know
it's
what that
essentially
means.
essentially the origin of what we look at as drag today, and
voguing.
voguing and all kinds of. It came from the trans community, and where they did not have spaces where they could truly be themselves, so they created those spaces.
Particularly trans folks of color.
Correct,
Right.
trans folks of color, which we can basically thank for so many things in our
This is
society.
true.
Like-
This is true. Yeah.
Well, and just to add to that, as you watch this documentary, they don't all. Sandy was talking earlier about not necessarily having the terminology or the model.
right.
I don't think the word trans even comes
Wasn't-
up.
wasn't
No,
in
it
the
doesn't.
documentary because
Yeah,
it
wasn't
didn't
something-
exist.
It didn't,
Yeah.
it
They were
didn't-
drag queens.
Correct, and
But now we would put the label trans
Yeah.
women of color on
Exactly,
them. But
yeah.
that's that way of being hadn't been fully figured out yet
Right.
for everyone.
But they
Yeah.
were living it, and they were living
Yeah.
it, and they were supporting each other,
trailblazers,
and and if you've seen if you see the series Pose, which is great, but definitely a kind of Hollywoodified version of it. But talking about the families, the families, the people, the houses that adopted the people in there so that they had safety, they had a place to belong, and that they were cared for, and that is so important. And there's so much beauty in that, and I think that it's such a great documentary that is overlooked by a lot of people. So check it out. It was on Netflix. It's out there.
Yeah, I think it's on Hulu,
Yeah,
Prime.
you can also buy it, and there's an extended version which goes into all these other interviews. If you really want to go down the rabbit hole, it's awesome. But
so many places you can go. I love it. I love it. Yeah.
all right, amazing. Well, thank you again so much for being with us, Sandy.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Always.
As always, I'm Dr. William Cox, and my co-host is Dr. Amber Nelson. Today's guest was Sandy Eichel, and produced by Eric Roman Beining, with music by Jay Arner. Diverse Joy is consumable as either an audio-only podcast or a video podcast, both accessible at diversejoy.com. Diverse Joy is the official podcast of Inequity Agents of Change, a nonprofit devoted to the dissemination of evidence-based approaches to reduce bias, create inclusion, promote equity, and enhance diversity. All that great Jedi work.
All the
is what
Jedi work.
Thank you. Let's talk about it. You can learn more at biashabits.com. You can learn more at biashabit.com.
Yes.
Thanks for listening. And Sandy, do you want to mention where people can find you if they're interested in hearing
You
more?
can find me on the socials. My handle is at Sandy Eichel. Eichel is spelled EICHEL, or at sandyeichel.com.
And we'll also have links to that on the Diverse Joy website to make that easier for all of you. And thanks again.
Yeah. Thank
Thank
you all.
y'all.
Thank you.